The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the next case was called. Judge Raymond Sterling, known for his sharp tongue and impatient demeanour, barely glanced up from his papers. His gavel struck the wood. "Defendant, step forward." The man in the defendant's chair rose slowly. His tailored navy suit clung to his broad frame, the crisp white shirt beneath untouched by a single wrinkle. He adjusted his silver cufflinks before clasping his hands in front of him, his expression calm, unreadable. Judge Sterling exhaled sharply, tapping his pen against the bench. His gaze swept over the man's polished shoes, the controlled stance. Another arrogant businessman who thought money could buy his way out. "Name?" the judge asked, voice laced with boredom. "Eric Calloway." Sterling smirked. No hesitation, no nervous twitching. Strange. "Charged with contempt of court and obstruction," the prosecutor chimed in. Judge Sterling leaned back, unimpressed. His fingers drummed against the bench as he eyed the man before him. "You must think highly of yourself, Calloway, waltzing in here like you own the place." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff shifted. A reporter raised her pen. Eric didn't flinch. His stare remained locked onto the judge. Sterling scoffed. Another stiff corporate executive who thought the law bent for him. "You're in my courtroom now," the judge continued, voice laced with amusement. "And I don't care how expensive that suit is, you're still just another defendant." The silence stretched. Then Calloway's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Judge," he said smoothly, "are you sure you want to finish that sentence?" Sterling's amusement flickered. Something was off. And he was about to find out exactly what. The judge's gaze narrowed, his fingers still drumming, but now with a hint of hesitation. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes studying Eric Calloway. There was something about the man's composed, almost bored demeanour that unsettled him. "What's your game, Calloway?" The courtroom waited in taut silence, as if the air itself held its breath. The reporters' pens were poised, eager to capture every moment. Eric remained unfazed, his hands clasped in front of him, his back straight, his feet planted firmly on the ground. He didn't look like someone about to face judgment. He looked like someone in control. Sterling squinted, too calm for someone in a position like this. "You know, I've seen my share of smug faces in here," Sterling began, his voice cutting through the silence. "But you? You take the cake. Do you think I'm going to let you waltz out of this with a slap on the wrist?" Eric's lips twitched just for a second, as if trying to suppress a smile. He stood still, his posture unyielding. The room held its breath. "I'm not here to play games, Judge," Eric replied coolly, his voice steady, unshaken. "But I do think you'll want to listen to what I have to say." The judge's face reddened. He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped himself. Something in Eric's voice, something in his composure, gave him pause. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, spoke up, her voice breaking the tension. "Your Honor, we have a clear case here. The defendant obstructed the investigation and openly mocked this court. This is not a game." But Eric only glanced at her for a moment before returning his gaze to the judge. There was no fear in his eyes, no guilt, just quiet confidence. "I'm not here for your theatrics, Calloway," Sterling snapped, straightening up again. His voice dropped, becoming more calculated. "You think you're special? That money and status can save you?" Eric finally let a hint of a smile break through. "Money and status may not save me, Judge," he said, his tone low but deliberate. "But I'll be the one saving you today." A collective shiver ran through the room. The judge froze, his mind racing. What was he saying? What did he mean by that? Sterling leaned back, glaring at Eric. This wasn't the kind of defendant he was used to dealing with. Most men in his courtroom would have broken by now, pleading for mercy. But Eric seemed to be in control, not just of himself, but of the situation. The reporters exchanged confused glances. The prosecutor's brow furrowed. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't like it," Sterling finally said, his voice a mix of frustration and curiosity. Eric's smile deepened, a small, almost imperceptible chuckle escaping his lips. "I'm not playing, Judge." He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, as if performing a well-rehearsed act. "I'm just here to show you who I am." Sterling's eyes flickered to Eric's hand, his body stiffening. Something about this wasn't right. Eric pulled out a small leather wallet and opened it, revealing a badge, a gold badge with the seal of the government etched into it. The courtroom fell silent. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Sterling's face drained of color, his eyes locked onto the badge, then to Eric's unflinching gaze. It hit him like a ton of bricks. "No. You can't be," Sterling stammered, his words caught in his throat. Eric let the silence hang for a moment longer, savoring the tension. "I think it's time you found out exactly who I am, Judge." The shock in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor stood frozen, her mouth agape. The reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Sterling's hand trembled as he reached for his gavel, but he couldn't find the strength to bring it down. Eric Calloway wasn't just a defendant, he was the Attorney General. Judge Sterling's fingers hovered above the gavel, but he didn't bring it down. His face, once full of smug authority, had paled to a sickly shade. The weight of realization pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. Eric Calloway, the man he had been mocking, the so-called defendant, wasn't just another corporate executive or privileged businessman trying to buy his way out of trouble. He was the Attorney General of the United States. Sterling swallowed hard. The tension in the room crackled like electricity. The courtroom, once filled with the quiet hum of anticipation, had fallen into an eerie silence. The prosecutor, who had been confidently building her case just moments ago, sat motionless. The reporters, normally eager to scribble every word onto their notepads, were frozen, their pens hovering above paper, their eyes wide with disbelief. Eric stood unwavering, his gaze locked onto Sterling. He did not smirk, nor did he revel in the judge's discomfort. Instead, he remained composed, controlled, as if he had expected this reaction. Sterling exhaled slowly, forcing his grip to tighten on the gavel, as if that alone could restore the power he felt slipping from his grasp. This is some kind of joke," he muttered, though even he didn't believe his own words. His voice lacked the authority it had carried just moments ago. Eric tilted his head slightly. "Do I look like I'm joking, Judge?" Sterling's eyes flicked to the badge again. The embossed seal of the Department of Justice glinted under the courtroom lights. It was real. There was no mistaking it. The whispers started, a low ripple through the crowd. "Attorney General?" someone murmured. "This can't be real." The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, standing a little straighter. The security officers by the entrance instinctively placed their hands near their holsters, unsure if they were supposed to act. The balance of power had shifted. Sterling, still desperate to regain control, forced himself to lean forward, his hands clasped together, his knuckles whitening. "If you are who you say you are, Calloway," he said, his voice thick, "then why are you sitting in my courtroom as a defendant?" Eric let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "That's an interesting question," he said, his voice steady. But the real question is, why are you sitting on that bench, Judge? Sterling's stomach twisted. The reporters immediately caught on to the weight of that statement. Pens scratched against the paper. Cameras clicked. The atmosphere had shifted. The prosecutor, finally finding her voice, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, if I may," she said hesitantly. Sterling shot her a glare, but it lacked its usual sharpness. He was losing control of the room. Eric took a step forward. The bailiff instinctively reached for his belt, but Eric merely held up a hand, a silent assurance that he wasn't a threat. "Judge, you made some interesting remarks before," Eric continued, his voice smooth but deliberate. "You assumed I was just another defendant, that I was beneath you, that I deserved ridicule before a fair trial." Sterling's lips parted, but no words came out. "Tell me," Eric pressed, his eyes never leaving the judge's, "is that how you treat everyone who stands before you?" The question sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Sterling felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He clenched his jaw. Control. Regain control. "I don't answer to you," Sterling snapped, his tone harsher than he intended. Eric's expression remained neutral. "No," he said simply, "but you do answer to the law." A muscle twitched in Sterling's jaw. Eric took another step forward, placing the badge down on the defendant's table. "Do you know why I'm here today?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Sterling didn't answer. Eric's eyes darkened. "I'm here because this courtroom, this very bench, is under investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sterling gripped the armrests of his chair. "That's absurd," he spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eric lifted a single brow. "Is it?" The prosecutor, who had been reviewing her notes just moments ago, suddenly stiffened. She turned to Eric with wide eyes. What kind of investigation?" she asked carefully. Eric's gaze never wavered. "Judicial misconduct," he stated flatly. The words rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Sterling's hands clenched the bench so tightly his fingers ached. "You," he started, but Eric wasn't finished. "I didn't just come here today as a defendant," Eric continued. "I came here to observe, to see firsthand the way this courtroom is run. And I must say, Judge—" He leaned forward just slightly. "I'm not impressed." Sterling's chest rose and fell rapidly. The prosecutor's face paled as she flipped through her notes. "Your Honor," she stammered, "I was not informed of any—" Eric held up a hand, silencing her. "Of course you weren't," he said calmly. "This investigation has been ongoing for months." Sterling's mind raced. No, this couldn't be happening. This was his courtroom, his authority, his power, and yet here he was, being confronted by the highest-ranking law official in the country. The weight of the moment pressed against him like a suffocating force. Eric let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking again. "Judge, let me ask you something," he said, his voice quiet, yet deafening in the stillness. "How many men and women have you treated the way you treated me today?" Sterling said nothing. Eric took another step forward. "How many lives have you ruined because you enjoyed the power?" Sterling's breath hitched. Eric's next words were soft, but they carried more weight than anything spoken in that courtroom before. "And how many of them didn't have the power to fight back?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling felt the walls closing in. Eric Calloway wasn't just here as the Attorney General. He was here as his reckoning. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Sterling's heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow. He was no longer the confident judge who had walked into the courtroom that morning. Now he was a man backed into a corner, facing a foe he had no hope of defeating. Eric stood before him, composed, calm, untouched by the storm he had stirred. The courtroom watched in stunned silence, waiting for the next move. Sterling's fingers twitched nervously, still hovering over the gavel. But his grip no longer felt like it could command authority. The sound of his heart pounding in his ears drowned out any sense of control he once had. Eric's eyes flickered to the gavel. He could see the judge struggling. The power was slipping away from him piece by piece, and Eric felt no rush to finish this. Let Sterling feel the weight of his own mistakes. Let him stew in his fear for just a moment longer. Eric didn't need to speak to take control of this room. The judge had already given him the power with every word he'd uttered. Sterling was the first to break the silence, but his voice was smaller now, cracking under the pressure. This is a mistake, he muttered, his words barely above a whisper. This can't be happening. Eric's gaze remained cold. He didn't pity the judge. He didn't need to. The mistake, Eric said slowly, his voice steady, was thinking you could abuse your position without consequences. Sterling's face flushed, his anger bubbling up, but it was evident now he was scared, too scared to act, too scared to maintain his composure. Eric took a step forward. He wasn't threatening, just a steady movement that closed the gap between them. The judge's chair creaked under the pressure of his rising panic. What are you going to do now? Sterling's voice quivered, a last-ditch attempt to hold on to some semblance of his former self. Eric looked down at the badge, still lying on the table, symbolizing the very power Sterling had taken for granted. He straightened up, meeting the judge's eyes with unwavering calm. I think you know what I'm going to do, Eric said, the words precise and final. I'm going to make sure you never sit in that seat again. The judge's mouth opened, but no words came out. His breath hitched as his mind tried to grasp what was happening. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him. Eric could see the panic flash across Sterling's face, sweat beading along his forehead, his mouth dry, his body rigid with a fear he could no longer mask. You've spent years abusing the system, Eric continued, his voice growing colder, thinking you were untouchable, unaccountable. Well, Judge Sterling, the system will bring you to justice. Sterling's face contorted with rage, his hands shaking, but even he knew his power was gone. Eric didn't need to say more. The weight of the situation had already settled in. He stepped back slightly, giving the judge space to process. But Sterling didn't move. Couldn't. He was trapped in his fears and his arrogance. The room remained deathly silent. The audience had witnessed something they could never unsee. They had witnessed the downfall of a man who thought he was above reproach. Eric's eyes never wavered. He could feel the judge's internal collapse, every ounce of confidence that had once defined him now crumbling to dust. The reporters were on edge, their pens still poised in disbelief. The bailiff stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The prosecutor, once poised and confident, now seemed to be holding her breath, unsure if this was some kind of setup or the real deal. But Eric knew this wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was something far more significant. Sterling wasn't just a judge about to be taken down. He was the embodiment of the corruption that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for so long. And Eric Calloway, the Attorney General, was here to bring that corruption to light. There was no escape, no way out. Sterling was trapped by his arrogance, by his abuse of power. Eric didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to make threats. His very presence, the weight of his words, and the quiet, controlled power he exuded were enough to break the judge. Sterling's face twisted in defeat. His shoulders slumped and his hands fell limply to his sides. He could no longer hold on to his facade. He was just another man, a man who had thought he could play God and had been exposed for the fraud he was. Eric's voice was calm as he spoke the final words that sealed the judge's fate. "Your Honor," he said, letting the words settle into the heavy silence, "I think it's time for you to step down." Sterling's breath caught in his throat. He knew it was over. There was no fighting this. No escaping the consequences of his actions. The gavel never fell. And for the first time the courtroom was truly silent. Eric turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, leaving Judge Sterling to wrestle with the consequences of his downfall. The room remained in stunned silence, as if none of them could fully comprehend what had just transpired. Sterling, still sitting in his chair, tried to collect himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The air in the room was thick with the weight of his defeat. The bailiffs and security officers, still unsure of how to act, stood frozen, unsure whether to follow Eric or to deal with the broken man in the judge's seat. The reporters, sensing the end of the show, began to murmur among themselves, their pens frantically scribbling down every moment of this monumental power shift. But Eric didn't turn back. He had made his point. He had shown the world what could happen when power was abused, when those in positions of authority thought they were invincible. Eric's footsteps echoed in the empty courtroom as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't need to say anything more. The message had already been delivered. The gavel never fell, but justice had been served. If you were moved by this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more gripping, real-life tales of justice and power. Stay tuned and don't miss the next chapter of unbelievable revelations.